Okay, so what are the implications then as far as practice and instruction are concerned? This is a typical model of instruction, and here are some of the key phases on the left-hand side here. So most coaches would convey information to the learner using verbal instructions and demonstrations. The coach would then have to decide how he or she was going to structure practice, whether they're going to do drills or grids or small-sided games, and then they would need to provide feedback. There is an important differentiation here between performance and learning. Performance is something that's transient, is what you would observe within that particular practice session, as opposed to learning is something that is permanent, so it conveys an element of retention and transferability of that skill to the real-world situation. If we want effective performance within the session, then the research evidence would suggest that, to a large extent, the more information we provide, the better. So if you provide lots of verbal instruction and demonstrate often, then there's a better chance that performance will be good within the practice session. If you did repetitive, blocked practice of a single skill, as characterized by drills and grids, this also tends to result in better performance within the session. And likewise, the more feedback we provide, more often and the more detail, the better performance tends to be. Difficulty for the coach, however, is what you see is not what you get. And something called a reversal phenomenon exists. In that, in the context of learning, actually, seems that the evidence would largely suggest that the best approach would be to argue what is the least amount of information that I need to be able to provide the player for the player to be able to practice the skill independently. Do my practice conditions match the demands of competition? If expertise arises through specific adaptations to the unique constraints of the performance environment, then you need to overload the system for those adaptations to occur. So do my practice activities match and ideally exceed the demands of competition? And again, what is the least amount of feedback that I need to give the athlete for him or her to be able to learn independently? There's a difference here, of course. This middle bit is very coach-focused, coach-directed learning. This is a lot more learner-focused. Ironically, these are the conditions, of course, that you would see in non-coach-led street football-related activity. What we wanted to do a couple of years ago is there hadn't been a huge survey of what coaches actually do with their players. So what we did is we videotaped over 80 coaching sessions, soccer coaching sessions. We videotaped them, we coded them to try and identify what activities coaches were having their players engage in. So what we have here on the vertical axis is the proportion of time across the training session. Each training session roughly lasted 80 minutes, that the coaches spent having their players engaged in physiological work without the ball. Technical training is technical skills practice with no opponent. Skills practice is isolated skills work but with an opponent. These three blocks of activities we term training form activities. And then on the left-hand side of the graph here are activities that we deem to be playing form because perhaps they better reflected the demands of competition. So we've got small-sided games, condition games, phase of play, defense versus attack, and functional practices on things like set plays and so on and so forth. We had three groups of coaches. A third of the coaches worked with Premier League academies. A third of them were in centres of excellence, which are championship level clubs, one division down in England, and then a third of the players were non-elite. What we found was that on average 65% of practice time was spent in training form activity. 65% of practice time was spent in training form activity. That's a lot. So if you argue that these playing form activities best reflect the demands of competition and allow key adaptations to occur, there's a lot of time there that the coaches aren't spending in activities that seem to mimic the demands of competition. Arguably, you could say that it may be that some of these technical and skills practices can be adapted so that they're more game-like. But nevertheless, it's a lot of time to be spent over in this left-hand side of the curve. What's interesting as well, there are relatively few differences as a function of skill. It seems that irrespective of the level of the players, the coaches are pretty much doing the same things. So there seems to be a theory-practice divide. The theory and the anecdotal evidence which shows the importance of non-coach-led discovery learning type of environments suggests that this type of activity is very important in terms of the development of elite players. But when we actually look at what the coaches are doing in the club environment, a lot of time is spent in drill and grid-based practice, unopposed technical skills training, and in physiological work without the ball. We also had 3 different age groups. We had an under 9, an under 13, and an under 16 age group. And we pretty much got a similar pattern of results. And the most interesting observation here again is that there were relatively few differences as a function of age. So coaches had a preferred manner of delivering their sessions, and that didn't change greatly as a function of the age of the kids or the skill level of the kids that they were working with. So potentially a lack of progression there in regards to the coaching process. We also had a lapel microphone. We recorded the coach behaviors, and not surprisingly, the biggest or most frequently used instructional behavior was the provision of instruction. And the thing that happened least often was prolonged silence. So it could be surmised to say that the coaches are spending a lot of time in drill and grid-based practices, which are very close, which perhaps do not recreate the dynamic situations of matches with a lot of instruction. So it's a very prescriptive, hands-on approach to the instruction process. About a couple of years ago, we were actually approached by one of the top Spanish teams, and they were interested in trying to improve the decision-making skill of their players. So what they asked us to do is do pretty much the similar approach to what we did there with the coaches. We filmed coaching sessions at the under 17, under 13, and adult age groups. And we coded the activity to try and identify opportunities for players to make decisions. Our argument was, if you want players to be good at decision making, then surely you need to create learning environments that they actually have to make decisions. As you can see here, less than half of the time were players engaged in practice activities that required them to actually make strategic decisions. So it's related to the previous graph. Physiological work, no decisions. Technical training, typically no decisions. Skills practices, typically no decisions. The coach usually tells you, receive the ball here, turn and play the ball over there. Even a lot of the playing form activity don't involve decisions. A lot of the set play work, the defense against attack phase play work, the decisions are largely made by the coach at a strategic tactical level, and the players play around with how they're going to implement those decisions. So maybe the key issue here is that given that expertise arises through specific adaptations, I think we need to look very carefully at our practice environments and make sure that we're providing the right stimulus for those adaptations to occur. I'm not necessarily saying that all of this time that is spent in non-decision-making activity here, the purple bars, is not useful. But I guess the argument would be if you're trying to create players that are better at decision-making, but what happens if we increase the size of these blue blocks so they're up at the 16 to 70% mark? Would that result in us creating players who were better at making decisions? So there's an interesting debate going on at the moment, and I think it's reflected in some of the changes that are occurring in coach education curriculums around the globe. And the debate essentially is how important is prescriptive coaching as opposed to more hands-off approaches to instruction, such as guided discovery learning. Some of the organizations are embracing models like this is Carl Newell's constraints-based model of learning, where in essence the model argues that the behavior observed by the players or the adaptations that the players take part in are largely the product of a confluence of constraints. And these constraints relate to player characteristics, environmental characteristics, and the constraints of the task themselves. And that the challenge for the coach, in essence, is to act as a catalyst to identify all these different constraints and how they shape and mold the learning environment. And then to shape and mold those as that behaviors that are needed emerge through the context of small-sided games. So in other words, the philosophy, in essence, is let the game be the teacher, always work within the context of the game, but manipulate all of these different constraints so that the behaviors that you want the players to practice emerge naturally under guided discovery, as opposed to having to take isolated skills into grid and drill-based practices and to provide lots of instruction as to how to refine and develop those skills. I'll briefly illustrate some examples here in relation to the task constraints. These are just some of the things that coaches can do. You know, coaches can manipulate conditions or rules, such as one touch and two touch. You must score off a cross. You must score from a shot from the outside of the box. Even if you take a game like football and you have two conditions, one where the teams can only score with a shot from outside the box, and another condition where teams can only score with a shot from inside the box, it actually creates two very, very different games. And the players structure themselves very differently. In the shooting from the outside the box, you have to have a central striker who can hold up the ball and lay it back off to players to shoot. In the situation where you have to score from inside the box, you usually get a lot more width. But the key issue there is you change the constraints, you change the environment, and you allow players to solve the problem. So you're creating adaptive expertise and more effective decision makers. I'll flick through these quickly. These are all similar things, similar task constraints, pitch markings, number of players, time. All these factors can be manipulated to create new challenges and dynamic learning environments for players. So let me finish with three questions. I guess there's an opportunity for you guys to provide answers and to think yourselves in terms of how these questions may apply in terms of your own cultures and own countries. The first question is, how do we increase the amount of practice? Not just the quantity, but also the quality. Okay, we know that in a sport like soccer, where early specialization is the norm, in excess of 10,000 hours plus is needed to become an elite player. I think we're probably nudging nearer towards the 20,000 hours now, to be fair, by the time you make an elite international level player. So how can we make sure that we get players to engage in the sport early and to accumulate the right amount of practice? How can we ensure that that quality of practice is appropriate as well, so that the necessary adaptations occur? Particularly a big issue at the moment, of course, given that kids don't spend a lot of time playing street football like they used to now. Cultural changes, access to PlayStation and MP3 means that kids don't spend as much time in street sports as they used to do. So how can we recreate those conditions, perhaps, within the formal constraints of the environment? Secondly, and most importantly, how do we ensure that the demands of practice mimic the demands of competition? I do a fair amount of work also with a lot of the Olympic sports in the UK, and I've been around a lot of the sports, and it still does surprise me the extent for which coaches spend a lot of time in drill and grid-based practices that don't necessarily mimic the demands of competition. Okay, I think the specificity rule is probably one of the strongest rules in science. If you want adaptations to occur, then your practice environment must mimic the necessary demands of match play. And then I guess, how do we change coach education and perhaps society's view of coaching, such that the coach is not necessarily somebody who has all the knowledge and conveys that in knowledge and is always shouting and instructing and organizing structured drill and grid-based practices. Perhaps the coach is somebody who is aware of the learning environment, aware of the factors that impinge upon the learning environment, and can craft and shape and mold those such that the role is more one of a catalyst to provide the right environment for learners to learn independently. Okay, thank you.